The Institute of Internal Auditors presents All Things Internal Audit Tech. In this episode, Ernest Anunciacion talks with Marko Horvat about how global AI regulations are reshaping governance, risk management, and the role of internal audit. They discuss why regulators are prioritizing risk to individuals and how AI governance spans the full system lifecycle.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's episode. I'm Ernest Anunciacion, CIA and former Chief Audit Executive. I am joined by Marko Horvat. He's a recognized expert in AI regulation. So, Marko, welcome to the show. Would you like to do a quick introduction of yourself to the audience?
Sure. I'm Marko Horvat, CPA. I'm the Senior Vice President of Business Transformation at ELB Learning, where we help organizations prepare themselves for the AI future.
Awesome. So let's jump into it. For a while now, it feels like AI regulation has been slow and theoretical, but now it's clearly accelerating. Across the globe, we're seeing governments move from different principles and guidelines to things that are becoming much more binding in terms of requirements. And that shift has some major implications for organizations as it pertains to governance, risk management, and even internal audit. So, Marko, what are you seeing in the regulatory environment, and why is this happening now?
The leading voice in all of this stuff is coming out of Europe with their AI regulations. And the interesting thing about that is, traditionally when we think about audit as it pertains to business, maybe this is my bias being a CPA, obviously, but usually we're really concerned with the idea of material misstatements and the quality of the financials that are coming out, the representations we're making to the public and to our investors, et cetera. But the interesting thing about the focus of these AI regulations is when we talk about things like risk, we're not talking about risk of financial misstatement. What they're primarily concerned about is risk to individuals in human populations. Basically anything that uses AI to label, target, assess either individuals or characteristics of individuals is really the primary concern of these regulations.
Can you help me unpack that just a little bit? So I'm trying to think too in terms of what the focus of certain regulation and legislation is. So obviously there's kind of the transparency around artificial intelligence. One of the big risks that I see out there are deep fakes and misuse of artificial intelligence. So is that kind of what they're going after?
That's a part of it. There's different tiers of, the EU regulations in particular, they have different risk levels. So if you're going to be using AI within your organization, you have to determine sort of what is the associated risk of using that AI. And when we talk about the risk, we're talking about the risk to the people that are being impacted by it. So to illuminate that a little better, the highest risk is sort of like the thou shalt not. Those are sort of barred from use. And that's basically intentionally using AI to trick and sort of scam people, those sort of things. And then as you descend down the different risk levels, they're mostly concerned with the ability of AI to adjudicate in a way that impacts people directly. So things like using AI as a means of determining the creditworthiness of an individual, or using AI as a recruitment tool in terms of how you hire people. So anytime there's judgment being made by the AI system, those are the types of risks that are involved. And the risks they're mostly concerned about is labeling people or judging people or barring people from opportunity without a human in the loop. So that's a really, really interesting point of view versus, traditionally when we think about risk within an organization, it's more about the internal risk and things that we're developing within the organization, right? The representations of what's going on within the business, not necessarily how it's impacting stakeholders outside the organization from, this sort of labeling or judgmental sort of perspective.
I think that makes a lot of sense. It's more about almost creating kind of metadata on human beings or individuals and that not being taken into account. So when regulators are putting this stuff together, what are their expectations for organizations? So what do they want businesses and companies to kind of demonstrate in terms of how they comply with these types of regulations?
I think the interesting part about that is from a compliance perspective, they want organizations to basically fully understand, or to the best that they can, understand how the AI is being used, how it's impacting the people that it's being targeted towards, and to be able to monitor that entire process sort of end to end. And that introduces a couple of interesting challenges that we haven't fully embraced in the past, right? So The regulatory life cycle of AI, for example, is a good sort of starting point when we talk about that. Whereas in the past, where internal audit was that sort of third line of defense, right? So the first line was you have your business process owners that are developing the system in an ethical, regulatory compliant way. And then you have sort of the second line that comes in that ensures that, that there's compliance and then ongoing monitoring. And then, the auditors come in as an independent third-party observer within the organization to make sure that everything's going according to plan. With the new AI regulations in place that are coming down, there needs to be involvement in the entire life cycle, right? So, we're talking about from the very design of the entire system, making sure that we have a good human in the loop design for certain critical, high risk types of activities, making sure that the data quality is good so that it's representative of your entire data set, not that we have, biases that might be introduced that could affect the outcomes. So doing like a thorough review of the data that's going into the system, sort of reviewing everything from like an algorithmic understanding rather than sort of an end result compliance perspective is a different point of view than traditionally internal audit has ever had. And having to be involved at sort of every one of those stages, as opposed to sort of reviewing things at the end, I think is a really interesting and could be potentially tricky position for internal auditors to be in, considering the fact that at the same time, they need to maintain that management independence.
Right. And that's a really unique perspective, Marco. I still believe that a lot of organizations see AI governance more as a technology or compliance issue. But the way that you just described it, you're saying that internal audit has a role across the entire AI regulatory lifecycle. And I agree. I think there's, kind of three areas specifically with auditors where they can help. In addition to what you mentioned, readiness assessments, which is really the most critical piece, because a lot of companies can't even answer the question that's very basic, like, where are we actually using AI? You got to believe that people have on their own personal accounts, they're using ChatGPT, even if their company isn't allowing for those tools there. So you mentioned a little bit of the design reviews, evaluating the frameworks where they have fit for regulatory expectations, and then obviously the ongoing assurance. So another follow-up question to that, Marco, what are some of the skill sets do you think internal auditors need in order to, provide value as it pertains to this AI regulation?
This is also really interesting, right? And when you think about it, there has to be a certain level of AI literacy that's just beyond the basic, how do you write a prompt in ChatGPT that returns what you need? When we talk about the requirements in order to fully understand the system, we're not talking about that they need to be able to go in and, write lines of code, the level of expertise that you need to sort of natively develop an AI solution. But what they do need to understand is sort of understanding how these AI models work, right? And so one of the big things that is important in this oncoming wave of AI regulations is explainability, right? So explainable AI is something that's incredibly important. So one of the things that's been really, really tricky is sort of the black box problem, where a lot of AI sort of operates within the black box. We're not exactly sure how it works. And so from an auditability perspective, how do you audit something when you don't understand how it got to that conclusion? And so now there's tools that are being developed around sort of explainable AI, where you can sort of look at the output and say, does that output make logical sense? Can you determine how someone would reach that conclusion? So when we talk about how do internal auditors prepare themselves from a skills perspective, it's understanding hallucinations, like what are, how that the hallucinations exist, how do you identify hallucinations, identifying model drift. So, one of the things I've seen is that you'll have a good AI model and over time, it sort of evolves, it sort of changes and it'll drift away from sort of the initial design. So understanding that, when has it sort of gone off the rails, how has it fundamentally changed from the initial design of the model? And being able, like I said, to identify the explainability of the AI and, act accordingly.
Yeah, it's a really good point. And so follow up to that too, then Marco, in practicality, when you look at organizations, what are some of the common gaps and red flags do you see from an audit standpoint?
I think there's three big problems or challenges that comes to AI. Like the biggest one, I think, is shadow AI. So, McKinsey did a survey last year where they looked at AI usage within organizations, and they found that 90% of people were using AI in some sort of capacity at work. And you look at that compared to only about 65% of organizations have a fully articulated AI usage policy. So that creates a lot of risk to organizations, especially with these oncoming regulations, where it's really, really important for organizations to understand what AI tools are people using, how are they using them. So that shadow AI usage, I think, has two components to it. One is, what are all the tools that people are using, so you can have a correct inventory, right? Because a key part of like the EU regulations is a risk assessment of the tools. And you can't do a comprehensive risk assessment of the tools if you don't know all the tools that you are using. And the second part of that is, when it comes to shadow AI, is how are they using those tools? Because when you're looking at the risk assessment, it's not necessarily just the capability of the tools that you're assessing. It's the use case within the organization that's also incredibly important. So there's a risk there where there's a mislabeling of the risk assessment, because people are using the AI in a fundamentally different or unauthorized way. So that is one of the challenges. The other big challenge is, continuous monitoring, moving away from, the traditional periodic check to being able to continuously monitor the system and the environment, so you can identify things like biases that can be recognized through different patterns that come in, or the model drift that I was talking about earlier. And I think the third biggest gap is third-party ecosystem audits, which has sort of been an ongoing challenge that we've had. We have the same problem with cybersecurity, right?
Right.
Making sure that the third-party tools that we use, what kind of risk are we introducing by using them, the sort of right to audit clauses we have with those organizations, I think are going to be tremendous challenges for us to look at.
Yeah, the last one, the third-party AI risk, is especially tricky because most companies or organizations will often just assume that the vendors own the risk, right? That it's taken care of by them, but the regulators won't see it that way. And so if you're using AI in your processes, you're still going to be accountable for it, even if it's embedded in those third-party solutions. So let's shift gears a little bit now. If AI governance can't be treated as a future issue anymore, and everything that we kind of covered in today's episode, what would you advise internal audit teams to be doing right now?
I think it's getting to those fundamental sort of data literacy, right? To make sure you have a good foundation in terms of your ability to assess and review and gather information throughout your entire organization. I think that's really important. I think it is important for the internal auditors to understand the overall direction that management is, or posture that management is taking with regards to AI, in terms of what are their future ambitions, so they can understand sort of the risk horizon that is coming at them. I think it's really, really important for them to be thinking about, how do we deal with shadow AI, continuous monitoring, and third-party audits? And not only that, but like, what is the additional risk we're introducing into the organization? So as we transition from, a situation where we're, testing data on a periodic basis, and the reason we do that is this sort of idea that, from sort of a meta perspective, right, is that we can't know everything all the time, all at once. So we engage in, sampling and other methods on a periodic basis as a means of assessing risk as part of the overall procedure. If you move to a system where it's all data, all on, all the time, then I think that also, introduces additional risks to the organization, because now that sort of known or knowable sort of standard when it comes to things going wrong has fundamentally changed. And thinking about how introducing all of this data can also introduce additional risk, and the ability to stay on top of it and monitor it is going to become incredibly important as we transition into this always on, all knowing, omniscient sort of future that everyone is sort of striving for.
Yeah, it's an interesting point where we're at technologically, right? I feel like there's a gold rush in terms of every company incorporating AI as part of their solutions, coming up with new software. There's this explosion of data that's coming along with it. And so I think the only thing I'd add to you, or what AI or what internal audit should be doing now, is partnering with legal and compliance. That just feels essential to me. all these regulations, they cut across legal, privacy, compliance, technology, ethics, right? And auditors, internal auditors are uniquely positioned to connect those dots and provide that independent assurance.
Yeah, and I think a lot of that, governance too, right? So it's not just what it's who knows it and who has access to it and what are they doing with that access. That's becoming incredibly important for organizations to consider in terms of as they move into this sort of always on frontier.
For sure. Well, Marko, this has been incredibly insightful. Really appreciate your perspective here. I think if there's one message for internal audit leaders to take away from our conversation, it's that AI regulation is no longer theoretical, and waiting is only going to put your organization at risk. Every CAE that I talked to today has or AI as part of their audit plan, and so we've got a critical role to play, not just in the assurance, but Marko, like you said, even earlier on in the adoption lifecycle. And that'll help organizations kind of build that trust, resiliency, and accountability when it comes to AI. So, Marko, thank you so much again for joining us today.
I appreciate it. And it's amazing to see this journey of, how internal audit is really taking on this trusted advisor role within organizations to maintain that independence and really be sort of an added voice of sort of ethical and compliance and all these other things within the real-time working of the organization. So it's really exciting. It's a really exciting space to be in.
100% agree. So that's it for today's episode. Again, I'm Ernest Anunciacion. That was Marko Horvat. Appreciate you guys listening in. And as always, stay classy, humanoids.
Hey, Audit Pros, GAM is back March 9th through the 11th in Las Vegas. It's where internal audit leaders come together to talk governance, emerging risk, and what's next for the profession. If you want smart conversation, fresh ideas, and some great networking along the way, head to the IIA website and register for GAM today. If you like this podcast, please subscribe and rate us. You can subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. You can also catch other episodes on YouTube or at theiia.org. That's THEIIA.org.